do you make of this judgment? Is this a massive intrusion by unelected judges overruling Parliament?
No, I don't see it as that at all. What I see it is a decision by the Supreme Court to step into a vacuum that has been created by the Prime Minister choosing not to observe the unwritten rules of our Constitution. The whole thing about the UK Constitution is that a lot of it depends on convention. That is on trust, that people will behave in particular ways. And what we've seen as the Brexit crisis has developed is a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who is increasingly willing not to observe those unwritten rules. The clear unwritten rule is that in modern times, you only prorogue Parliament for a very short time in order to start a new session or sometimes to postpone the start of a general election campaign. There are no other legitimate reasons for doing it at all. And actually, his decision to do this, where it's quite clear Number 10 lied to the public as to the motivation, was a clear breach of something.
And the Queen.
Probably the Queen as well. We don't know. I will leave that to one side. But certainly, the behaviour was dishonest. And in those circumstances, what the court has said is the court is prepared to step in, because the whole way in which our common law tradition works in this country is that if there is an egregious failure, there is the scope for the court to do something about it.
Of course, the counter-argument will be that everyone's thrown propriety out of the window, that Boris Johnson may be guilty of sharp practice, may have been had up for it, but at the same time, the House of Commons, in trying to frustrate the vote of the people, and you in working with the opposition to take control of the agenda from the government, I mean, that is behaving without propriety as well.
No, it isn't. Excuse me. We are there as members of Parliament to do our job as parliamentarians. I accept that it's unusual for the House of Commons to take control of the order paper and pass legislation that the government doesn't like, but it's perfectly within our constitutional rights to do it and our standing orders. So it's very, very clear. And it's happened precisely because the government has stopped listening to the House of Commons. Otherwise, that legislation wouldn't have been necessary.
It's still about frustrating Brexit, though, isn't it?
But the question is not about frustrating Brexit. Brexit may be frustrated, but the frustration is a self-induced one. The fact is we are in October 2019 talking about a national crisis over a no-deal exit from the EU that was never promoted by those who promoted leave in 2016. And the question for the House of Commons and the government, is where I'd like the government to refocus, is how do we get ourselves out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves? Now, I happen to think that the sensible way is a democratic one. We know what the choices are. We should go back and offer them to the public. Now, the outcome of that may well be a choice I don't like. People might vote for a no-deal Brexit. But at least...
hang on, wait a minute. Because I thought that was going to be off the table. I thought the choice was going to be Mrs May's deal or Boris Johnson's deal versus Remain.
Not at all. I've always taken the view that if there are a substantial number of people in this country who want a no-deal Brexit, refusing to offer them that choice in a second referendum would be unwise. There are different views on that.
I mean, that's neither Labour nor Lib Dem policy.
But it's been my consistent position for quite a long time, and I've said it publicly on many occasions. Now, that will have to be debated in Parliament, and ultimately Parliament will have to decide the terms of the question. But my view has always been that whilst I think a no-deal Brexit would be catastrophic for this country, to simply say we're taking it off the table if there's a significant number of people who want it would be wrong. But what we cannot go on doing is destroying our constitution and our institutions and trashing them in the way the government is doing in a circular argument that will not enable the government to get its way. I'm confident the Prime Minister cannot and will not be able to take us out on the 31st of October, and unless he wants to resign, which might be quite helpful, but as on the assumption he doesn't, he ought to listen.
Should he resign?
Well, I have to say, I think that the Prime Minister, who is so dishonoured, the truth is, by what he has been doing over the last 8 weeks, he's only been in power for about 8 weeks, and his track record is appalling. If I were in his position, I'd go. But I don't think he will go. And so as I can't force him to go, and I don't think I want to force him necessarily to go because that raises other problems, I think he ought to listen to what people are saying to him rather than just constantly running around saying do or die and inventing mad schemes that is just standing in a greenhouse and chucking bricks.
I mean, one explanation of his behaviour is that he quite fancied a general election because he thinks the people might be behind him.
Well, he may fancy
should we have a general election?
Well, we could have a general election, and it may well be that this is going to end up with a general election. But there are two things I would say about it. Firstly, there cannot be a general election until we have an extension of Article 50, because we cannot have a general election where we either crash out in the middle of it, or alternatively, the incoming government has 4 or 5 days to resolve what happens next before we crash out, which is completely wrong. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I think each of us as parliamentarians have to ask this question, is it going to solve anything? I have to say to you, I think that we will all come back, or some of us may not come back, but that's irrelevant. But back in December, if we have an election in December, you'll find in mid-December that we have a government with no majority, and we have a government where the issues are exactly the same as they are today. So the sensible thing to do is for the government to cooperate with Parliament, as I said earlier, to find a way out of this hole. And the sensible way is to have a second referendum. I keep on going on about it, and it ought to be capable of bringing us together. Instead, what we see is just wrecking moves by the government. And I have to say, Labour's conference disappoints me, because it seems to me that the Labour leadership show a complete lack of understanding about the depth of the national crisis or how you can solve it. The idea that Labour are going to win a general election is laughable. What we're going to find in the next week is that they will have dropped 2 or 3 points in the polls as their sheer inability of its leadership to come up with a coherent policy becomes more apparent. The sensible thing to do is for the government to cooperate with Parliament to find a way out.
And when should Parliament be recalled?
Well, I suspect we'll be sitting tomorrow. I think to sit this afternoon would be a bit unfair on people, but it's up to the Speaker. It isn't a question of recalling Parliament. We are technically still in session, and although I'm in the studio now, it would only take me 5 minutes to get back to the chamber.
OK, Dominic Grieve, thank you very much indeed.